Welcome everyone. My name is Myron Rogal and I coordinate the Justice and Peace Office for the Diocese of Saskatoon in Saskatchewan. So just a little bit more about me. I'm married with four not so young kids, so kind of age 14 to 7 at this point. And I've been involved with Catholic Conscience since the 2020 election when we were a bit of a pilot for their first campaign. And since then have been on the board for a couple of years, and so just exciting to see this conference come to fruition. So to begin with today, I invite you to think of two scenarios around the role of civic prayer in the public realm. And the first is to remember an event, maybe that happened recently, maybe some time ago, where it was a public event, a family gathering, maybe an outing with peers, where you were surprised to hear a prayer from a particular creed come forward. So I'll just give you a couple seconds to bring that to mind. And then next, a time perhaps when you felt compelled to bring prayer into a conversation, a meeting, maybe a civic event, but you somehow smothered that desire, maybe under the cloak of tolerance, fear, or even apathy. So I'll give you a couple more seconds to think of that one. So most Christian scholars and those outside the church of a variety of disciplines profess that Christendom is dead. So Peter Baltutis out of the University of St. Mary's in Calgary has given some very compelling arguments in this favor, or you may also think that it's not quite dead, but it's perhaps eroded significantly over the last couple generations. So I'm going to take this premise for granted today when speaking about prayer in the public realm, but I also want to postulate another premise, that there is hope, there's a trust and even an expectation to reclaim prayer within the public realm today. So I furthermore want to make the case, and going to the preamble of the Canadian Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for this, where there's a reference to the supremacy of God in the rule of law. And so I'm going to attempt today to say that this remains desirable for most Canadians. So I'm going to begin with some numbers. And now these numbers are dated. They go back to some Angus Reid polling in 2016. So we had Angus Reid himself come to Saskatoon to offer some of the insights from this polling at the time. But I also want to kind of speculate with these numbers that since 2016 we've become a much more diverse country with a lot more new Canadians here, and many of them prescribe to a specific faith connected to a major religion. So perhaps these numbers are similar, perhaps they're much different today, but for the sake of today's conversation I'll share some of them. So firstly, that 42% of Canadians signified that they were involved with at least one prayer-related activity each week. Most Canadians, next, 86%, even those who were inclined to reject religion, so 57% of that group, still viewed prayer as enriching for the person who prayed. So it was noted in the poll that Canadians pray for a variety of reasons, and you could probably name these. So the first, prayers of thanksgiving, to thank God, prayers of petition, to ask for assistance, and followed by prayers of guidance. So when you think back to that first example that came to mind, you might think that some of those reasons for prayer came about in that time when you were remembering that prayer. So 70% of Canadians profess that prayer adds to the life of their community, their country, and the world. 27% of those, that group again, who reject religion in Canada, even of that group, say that prayer adds to the life of their communities and country. So I want to offer today a few examples of this and where I see some hope for prayer in our Canadian context. So Indigenous spirituality. So Father Mian talked a fair bit about this morning, but simply to name, as he named, that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has offered a new path for the Church and Indigenous peoples to walk together towards healing in Canada. And this has opened some doors for, like the beautiful example he gave this morning, of entering into times of prayer together. So the deeper that we enter into this journey, the greater the realization that traditional Indigenous spirituality, and in particular the Catholic faith, are deeply intertwined in practice when people profess prayers in public. So these can be very complex, but if you've been at an event recently hosted by Indigenous people, it's very likely that they'll intertwine parts of traditional Catholic prayers with Indigenous spirituality. So that's not uncommon. And in Saskatoon, Greater Saskatoon Catholic Schools, so we have a similar funding model to Ontario, where there's publicly funding Catholic schools. The two largest Indigenous language schools in the world exist, specifically for the Cree language. So 16% of the students in the overall system would be self-identified as Indigenous, which would correlate with that level of the population who identifies Indigenous in Saskatchewan. So this would be much higher than the amount of Indigenous students attending public schools. And one of the reasons when they're asked why in their intake is because they have that openness to faith and to develop their faith and prayer. So recalling a story of the Pope Francis's penitential visit to Canada, and I was not part of that, but attended several listening circles afterwards with a group that went from the Diocese of Saskatoon. And I remember sitting around that circle, and when I talk about complexity of those relationships, that was very much the case. One person saying it was their dream come true to meet the Holy Father and see him, and the next person saying with some very colorful language that she detested that man, but yet she still felt this was an important step for the church and important for her to go. So just to note, there's a real openness there when it comes to Indigenous people, and an openness to prayer especially. So next I want to speak of an example of language and the profession of faith. So this one comes from the Conseil des Écoles Françaises en Saskatchewan, which is the French language school board, public school board for the province. So Saskatchewan, under Wilfrid Laurier's 1905 Saskatchewan Act, which is the condition for which we joined Confederation, and then you can actually kind of look more at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in itself. We're different from Manitoba in that it was not an absolute condition that we had faith-based French schools, but there is a strong argument and precedent, as has been the case with different legal cases across the province, that the French language schools have the right to operate as Catholic schools if they have a local mandate to do so. So in actuality, some of these schools resemble Catholic schools, and some of them are closer to contemporary public school models. So my wife teaches within the system my children attend. I've been on the school board, and I'm now just involved with the local school council. And as you enter the school, you see a large cross on the outside. So again, this is not a Catholic school. You see the Word of God prominently displayed. We have Mass twice a year in the school. We have the priests come in to offer confessions twice a year in the school. And albeit the majority of students would not be practicing Catholics, and a third or so would be of probably no faith at all, only a handful of those students opt out of those activities regularly. So to show this point no more interestingly, 3 years ago, the Conseil, the public board from this provincial board, asked that we institute an ethics class in tandem with the Christian ethics class as another option, a secular ethics class. And a year later, after 30% or roughly a third of the students enrolled from the school, all but 3 went back to a Christian ethics class, because in their view it was boring, quote unquote. That there's an ontological deficiency, as you know, kids like to ask that question, why? So the notion of civic ethics just wasn't satisfying that desire. So the school has really served as a hub of evangelization in the community, both in bringing several people back into the church formally, and as well has kind of challenged the Catholic school teachers in that school to come out of what Peter Baltusas has called the church fortress, right, and go into that mission mode that we're called through the Great Commission to make disciples of all nations, and as 1 Peter, we're here to give an account for the hope that is within us. So a couple of you were at the previous session on public office, so I won't say too much about that, but just more specifically maybe on prayer in public office, or rather the previous session on civic engagement. So prayer continues to hold a place in public office. And just driving by Queen's Park today on the way here, I was reminded that in that legislative assembly in Ontario itself, prayer is part of Christian prayer. The Our Father specifically is said on a rotational basis for whenever that assembly comes together. So how many of you here have been at a mayor's prayer breakfast, or have that in the cities where you come from? So those are quite common across Canada, and they provide an interface for church leadership and politicians to come together and at least to pray together, if nothing else at that time. So when we look at kind of the church's role in social discourse, a couple of examples here. So we have an annual day in Saskatoon when we honor the feast of St. Josephine Bakhita, who's the patron saint of women and men as well who are trafficked. And that day was kind of brought forward by the kind of way in which that day looks now was brought forward by two members of the Catholic Women's League. And in 4 years it has grown from a small gathering at the City Hall to about 400 people this past spring. And so when they first wanted to bring this idea before City Council, they were dissuaded from doing so, mostly from fellow Catholics, saying that the council would not accept this. And they went, and the council, including the mayor, unanimously said this was a great idea. Let's go ahead with it. And so this past event, I was particularly struck because there were 11 in Ontario. They're called MPPs. Saskatchewan, we call them members of the Legislative Assembly, MLAs. There were 11 members of the MLAs present there for that gathering. And it's really a prayer gathering followed by some educational components. And I was struck by they were also kind of almost equally split from across the aisle coming together for that. So prayer has a capacity to build unity. In Saskatoon, we have one of our parishes runs a warm-up center, which is the only overnight warm-up center for homeless men in the city. And each year we have a liturgy and a blessing of that space where the bishop comes and clergy gather from across the diocese. And during that time, again, civic leaders are invited to come, and many of them have expressed how important that is, even those who are of no faith, how important that is to have a blessing and to pray together when that space opens up each fall. So one final example here, and this is a civic event again. Saskatoon has the largest indoor Remembrance Day ceremony in Canada. And so we even had the Prime Minister attend, past Prime Minister, two past Prime Ministers now. But it's an event it's an interfaith event, but Christian prayers, Christian hymns are part of that event every year. And so when we look at Remembrance Day itself as a Christian country, it's a pillar really in memorializing that important event. So one kind of event, again, looking at civic outreach, so a project called Grow Hope Saskatchewan, which I encourage you just to Google. We don't have time to go into that, but essentially it's where donors support the sponsorship of local donated acres, donated by farmers and then there's a multiplication effect that happens through the federal government that's been happening back since the Pearson years to give that money through bank holders of the Canadian Food Grains Bank and disperse that into parts of the world where it's in need. But essentially it's an ecumenical project and prayer is really at the foundation of that project. However, interestingly, it's attracted, I think, because of the tremendous impact of the project, a lot of donors who are of no faith at all. And yet many of them have come to us and said that they've increased their trust in the project because it's a faith-based organization, because it's not all about a current agenda or someone's kind of getting on their horse and carrying a particular flag. But we've also heard expressions through that because it's connected to various churches, and again, not just the Catholic Church, that they see this as not going in a particular partisan direction, but it's serving serving all of humanity. So one other example here would be 12-step recovery programs that you're all familiar with. So faith in a higher power is a necessary part of those programs, and they're all rooted in prayer. So they remain to date, according to the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse and Addiction, 91.8% of Canadians who have successfully overcome a substance use disorder have reported using a 12-step mutual support program. So this represents a significant number, according to the Mental Health Commission of Canada, where 75% of Canadians say will eventually recover from a substance abuse disorder. And so if you look at that number, 1 in 5 Canadians, or about 6 million who go through that, that's a significant number of Canadians who are praying for prayers of petition and gathering in small Christian community in a function on a regular basis. So return to spirit, another example, maybe going into the first category here of Indigenous spirituality. Has anyone heard of return to spirit? Okay. Oh, great. Okay. Often don't hear people who've heard of it. So a recent event we had in Saskatoon, and returning to spirit, by the way, is just getting people to what Father Meehan talked about, that overall reconciliation. So it started out of the reconciliation discourse between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, particularly with the church, and it has evolved into a more general sense of reconciliation. This past year, though, we had someone come and sit at our table, just kind of spouted out their hatred for the church and for everything the church has done. And by the third day, we were breaking bread. We were sharing a meal together. I've gone for coffee since with a gentleman. Because it had the capacity of bringing that conversation to a higher level. And I bring up this example because there, where most of the participants at this workshop were Indigenous, they were asked to come up with a prayer each morning. And the prayer that they asked for each morning was the Lord's Prayer and the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi. So those are the two prayers they asked for each morning. I'll maybe move lastly into some examples around sport here. And so I'm in Toronto, so if you feel compelled to talk about the Toronto Blue Jays. So last year, during their very successful year, often you would see public examples during the game, a crossing, pointing to heaven, as when they made a successful player and needed help. So my own beloved Montreal Canadiens, who were defeated last night, often you see their coach making the sign of the cross after the national anthem. So it's very much there in sport. And a while back I was listening to a local sports commentator. I just turned on the radio, and he was talking about his own private faith and how important that was in his life, and how he prays every morning and every evening. And he's a bit of a lapsed Ukrainian Catholic, and I thought, where's this going? This is amazing. I almost had to do a double take. This was coming from a secular, well-known sportscaster. But where he was going with this was talking about the importance of prayer in the Western Hockey League. And this is often not shown in the media, or if you're at a game you might miss it. But after the game, each player will take a knee and say the Lord's Prayer together. So another way in which prayer is a common feature in our sports. Has anyone here heard of Father David Bauer, St. Mike's, and his legacy? So not only was prayer part of sport for him, but really that sport was a means to develop the whole human person in a holistic way. And many of those philosophies are still prominent with Hockey Canada, for example, that he was one of the pioneers in helping to develop. So because this was named in the last section, I was going to talk, in the last session I was at Bill 9 and 21 in Quebec. I don't want to say a whole lot more about that, but I want to share a little bit how prayer is also under attack in our country, so not to be naive with the previous examples that I've listed, but to really talk about a bit more about secularism itself. So secularism, that's being named in one of the arguments and in what the rationale is for bringing these two particular bills forward, one which will restrict has restricted the wearing of religious symbols, and the other one which will restrict prayer in the public in the public realm. So there's been substantial interfaith opposition to this, which is very healthy to see and a reflection of the life of faith in our country. But it's really to look at that question of what is the end itself of secularism and how can it be used to advance the common good. So one of the first references we have to thinking about how we look at secularism today actually goes back to St. Augustine in his famous writing, The City of God, where he talked about the church and the state interacting together, but still being separate realms. So when we think of secularism in that way, we can think of the diocesan priesthood that's referred to as a secular priesthood. But secularism was intended originally to be this bridge between the culture and the faith. So recently, on a CBC Massey Lecture series, Benjamin Berger, who's a legal scholar, described this as an intimacy between the state and the religion, the role of secularism. He described that religion is not a feature of the populace, but incarnationally foundational in the laws and freedoms that Western democracies enjoy. So secularism, however, in its modern application, at times offers little to appeal to complex moral dilemmas. And we're seeing some of these arguments come forth in Quebec now that it's sort of a whitewashing of talking about some of these deep, complex social challenges, for example, without the nuances and simply eliminating one of the voices being that voice of faith and that moral tradition from those conversations. So in this sense, it can abdicate responsibility from particular justice questions. So secularism in its original intent can actually help facilitate a more pluralistic culture where religious traditions have an irreplaceable role to play in shaping these key discussions around public policy. So perhaps prayer does have a place in the marketplace, but the question to ask are we the ones at times who are holding it back or who are shy to move that forward? So the compendium of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church describes that politics is one of the highest forms of charity, that it serves the common good. Hence, I cannot wash my hands of it, right? So we have a moral duty to enter the political realm at some level. We all have that duty. Furthermore, we have a duty not only to pray privately for those who are in office, but really to pray collectively as well, and to try and introduce prayer into the public realm wherever that may be possible. So Catholic conscience, in a sense, I think of the first election campaign that we did with Catholic conscience, and we interviewed each of the political leaders. In this case, they delegated, all but one party delegated that responsibility to another candidate, which was fine. And there was one candidate in particular, so three of them were Catholic. I would say all three were not, or three of the four were not practicing Catholics at the time, but the one candidate was actually brought to tears because she said, "I never knew my church taught all of this," right? And so that was very hopeful to see that come forward from Catholic conscience. So prayer is tangible, of course. This is another reason why it needs to be in the public realm. Pope Francis once reflected that we pray for the poor and then we give them something to eat. This is how prayer works, he said. So when prayer is offered authentically, it builds trust. It can serve as a source of detachment from our own partisan views and other earthly detachments. Prayer reorientates us, at a time in history when political ideologies all too often will shape the moral life rather than vice versa. So it has a way of removing false idols or demigods, because it brings us to absolute humility. I mean, prayer, we know through our Catholic and as well Christian tradition that there's nothing more humbling than coming to God in prayer. So furthermore, prayer can open our eyes to reading those signs of the times. It brings us beyond our own utilitarian mindsets to a higher place where innovative solutions and ideas can be offered beyond our own ideas. And I'm paraphrasing Pope Leo here, but he speaks about it in his recent encyclical, where he says, if you add up all of the individual rights combined, and then look at examples where the common good is kind of expressed par excellence. There's a plus factor there. So he's showing that it's not just a matter of our own human efforts, but really that prayer has a key role to play. So this is the task of Catholic conscience and similar organizations to reawaken the moral conscience, beginning with prayer. And I want to conclude today in the words of Emmanuel Monnier, who's the philosophy of personalism, which he was one of the pioneers in, who says, "Unhappy with the world, then become yourself the person you want others to be. Do yourself what you wish others would do. Don't criticize what is not being done. See what there is to do. Fit yourself in, then do it." So we have a little bit of time now before Mass for some Q&A or any comments that you'd like to share.
I can share based on some of your comments about the public sphere and prayer being tucked away. And so my context is I work for the Department of National Defense, and there was I have an edict on the word, that's not the word. It was a policy that came down King for Gen probably, that chaplains, they were no longer allowed to use the name of God while they were ministering. They had to make it like more ecumenical for all people. But I will say that we're finding other ways to share the word of God, and it's so one of the chaplains, he actually said, you know what, we have people of different faiths that use our sacred spaces, so we're going to use it at least once a week for Christian prayer. So it just started off like a small group, like we would reflect on the word of God, sing a little hymn, and then be on our day, and it's growing. Literally this week we had a Pentecost service, so it was interfaith, and many of us that had been kind of on this journey since the fall, we were all of a sudden, instead of just being like 1 and 2 here and there, we were 15 people in the room, and all sharing our testimony and what Pentecost means to us, right? And through that, like there's a colleague that sits two seats beside me, and so I didn't know that she was Catholic, and so now like she comes over all the time to chat, and she's like, "I'm having a day." I'm like, "It's okay, Katya, we're going to do the St. Michael prayer together, right?" Or you have like the young captain who's like, "You know what? I am searching to become Catholic. I'm being drawn towards the tradition rather than the sola scriptura," right? And it was just funny because I was the layperson there. I was the Catholic, and I had the two chaplains that were, one of them was United, one of them was Baptist, and here they're, Catholics believe this. Well, actually, no, that's not quite right. But even so much as people try to suppress the prayer, I'm encouraged by, like, we find different ways of becoming visible and becoming that light for people and evangelizing to people.
How public can you be? Are you trying to keep that under the radar, or is it?
No, like we have sacred spaces in several of the buildings on campus, and it's advertised that every Thursday we have a Christian prayer group. Everyone is welcome to join. When we do our worship sessions, they are advertised alongside, here's the health and safety, here's the pride group, here's this and that, right? So it's all on the up and up. But I do know that in speaking with the chaplains, it is a great pain for them that, they became chaplains because they wanted to share that love of the faith with people who need that meaning, right? Who need that backing, especially when they're being asked to undertake very difficult experiences. And so it really pains them that they're not specifically allowed to say it, but they're finding other ways, and it's a source of hope for them as well. So
I think too, because it comes from, that's a wonderful example, it comes from a need that those people are experiencing, right? Mm-hmm. So an example would be the warm-up center in Saskatoon. We took a lot of data last year, and one of the top needs of the top 3 that came through was spirituality, and most wrote Christian spirituality under that. And so next year we're going to have more more services to meet that need available, because we don't want to proselytize or impose the faith, but the people have strongly asked for that. And so when you can justify it as a human need, it becomes like any other way in which we serve people, right?
While we have a comment, one of the things that's going to be interesting to watch, because we were talking in the last session about Bill 9,
right,
and the restrictions on prayer, it's a really paradoxical thing that's happened because the government committed to the separation of church and state has now given the state authority to determine which religious groups can process and which can't. Because it's not about the procession, because you always had to get a permit to process, whether you were labor strikers or whether you were, environmentalists or whatever.
Roads blocked off.
But now they're discerning between religious groups who can proceed and who can process and who can't. And Phil just mentioned kind of a half offhand there, but that 4 or 5 have been turned down, but Archbishop Le Pin, the Corpus Christi procession has been given, their advertising has been given, which flipping it around is doubly ironic because there was a decision back in 2014, 2015, the Saguenay decision from the Supreme Court that a lot of people got excited about it because it prevented the Saguenay City Municipal Council from saying prayers at the beginning because there was an atheist who didn't like it. It was actually a really good decision because it made a clear delineation between the authority of a municipal or governmental body. But now we have a situation where the state has superseded that ruling, and the state will now discern which religions can appear in public.
So can I actually ask a clarifying question? We're running out of time, and I was almost scared to ask because the gentleman seemed very animated about it, so I'm like, maybe not the time to ask. But I know that there's a lot being said online, and my understanding was that this did not apply necessarily to individuals, it applied more to organizations requesting services from the federal government.
No, there's two different things there. One is that was the original bill, was the restriction on holding and open.
Okay, so are we talking about laicity or are we talking about Bill C-9?
Well, they're both.
They're both
that's
driving it. But
the latest legislation, and that's what Phil was alluding to. It was because of the disruption that was being caused by really pro-Palestinian groups who were using prayer as a political lever. And we don't need to argue whether they should or shouldn't, but that's what they were doing, and that's what the legislation was really aimed at. So there are two, they've been merged, but there are two separate things that have gone on in the last few years. One is the restriction on clothing and open symbols. The other is the actual manifestation of prayer in the public squares.
Okay. So maybe I'm late on that one.
and that one, as was mentioned, is still in front of the Supreme Court.
Right.
But you can bet that the groups that have been turned down,
sure,
they've got their Phil Horgans working
But and like I said in that one, he said kind of the same thing. It's like there's already going to be people, and I'm like, it's going to be overturned. Like it's not just like the Hate Speech Act in the CHRA was overturned.
Yes, go ahead.
First, I wanted to thank you for bringing the light from Saskatchewan. I'm from Ontario, but my mother was born in Saskatoon, and I've always known that her father was an MLA.
Oh, wow.
And it's so beautiful, may I say, for Torontonian to hear some of the stories that you bring us from there, which I'm thinking, I don't know if that would happen here, but it encourages me to try, to be honest. Sort of a funny question, though. I was talking to my MP about abortion, and he said something about the constitutional right to abortion. I said, it's not in the Constitution. And he said, he's a lawyer, he said, we understand the Constitution now through subsequent rulings of the Supreme Court only, so you can't just read the Constitution. I just wondered if you looked at it that way, the reference to God, or the understanding, how is the Supreme Court, I don't know if anybody, how is the Supreme Court
they've said
developed that
there's actually a term for it. It's a non-active part of the Constitution. It's language. You're talking about the supremacy of God?
Yes.
And they've said no, it doesn't have any effect or any bearing.
Yeah, although it's not dormant, right? Like that could be brought up again. it's not.
Maybe it needs to be.
Yeah, like there's, I don't know, but there's been legal precedent in what used to be that direction, but it's not final, right?
So we should surface it, maybe.
Yeah.
You can always come back, I guess. That's-
Yeah, it's still there is what I'm saying. So
It's still in there.
Hasn't gone anywhere.
Still in the anthem, right?
Yeah.
But too, I was just thinking when you were talking about Canadians coach said to be making the sign of the cross. They're all singing a hymn. It's the hymn national.
Yes.
They just don't realize.
No.
And if you know the French words, you say porter la croix.
Yep.
Yeah.
Jean carry the cross. And
Yeah.
the even more powerful one is deux fois trempé, drenched in the faith. Our values protect our houses and our rights. Like every 22,000 people and they get together in the bells and they're singing.
God keep our land.
But even in Quebec, every game there's a hymn being sung, so it will come back.
Even in
I just don't know it.
Yeah, and I haven't been in a meeting or conversation where I've seen any opposition, right? I think most people, there are some who are endlessly opposed to prayer, but and that's my whole point for it. I just wonder if we've been too dormant ourselves, that we haven't, we need to go back and remind people of something that they might not know about, but they're probably not opposed to in most circumstances. I don't think Saskatchewan's unique in that way. We're different in some ways, but it's...
I'm going to talk to our town council about the Josephine Bakita event, and I'll let you know.
Okay.
What happens in Ontario.
Right.
I'd love to. Maybe it's it would be a good social discussion for us to have about prayer.
I think the smaller the council, the better chance you have.
Yeah,
If it's not the city of Toronto, then...
Right, yeah. We do have a public, I don't know if that happens in Toronto, but it happens in a lot of Western cities, a public outdoor way to cross on Good Friday, which requires a permit just for logistical reasons, right? But last year there was someone who called me and he was, why is the church doing this out on the streets? And he was kind of opposed to it. And we started talking, and because I'm always thinking, what's the wound? What's the wound here? And this is someone who, he's a former politician, and he's very, very involved with, I think, areas that we would say share some common good on, particularly around the environment. But what he eventually got to, there was something with his dad and some hypocrisy. Okay, now I have him there, now we can talk further. But he eventually said, Myron, he said, I can appreciate why you're there, because I need something like that in my own life. I'm burning out right now. I need to know that there's a community of Christians, or whoever that group would be for him, that could walk alongside me, and that you guys are laying that at the cross. He's like, I'm not quite there yet, but I want to try and be there. So even that, right? So even where there is opposition, there's times to have those conversations. Yeah.
I've walked for years with the Stations of the Cross on Good Friday in Old Montreal. The CL organizes it from Montsecourt to the cathedral. And I think it was probably 10 or 12 years I did it with them, not once did anyone ever say anything negative. And a lot of people would just stand quietly while you went by. And a couple of years ago, I was actually taking pictures for the Corpus Christi procession down St. Catherine Street, and three street people, obviously evidently three people, all genuflected on the
Wow. Yeah.
It was something in their childhood.
Powerful public, but that's it, that Catholic or Christian memory, right? Something like that.
It doesn't go away.
Yeah. So that's all the time we have. We have Mass at 4, and then just to give you a little bit of a brief break before then, but thank you for joining the conversation.